The English summer, having made a brief and rather grudging appearance in July, had by late August retreated into a state of indecisive neutrality. It was in this condition of atmospheric non-commitment that the Vetchwood and District Historical Society held its annual garden party upon what was generously termed the west lawn of Vetchwood Hall. The lawn, which had the damp, downtrodden look of a well-used public footpath, sloped away from a terrace where trestle tables bore the weight of Battenberg cake, pallid sausage rolls, and urns of tea the colour of weak sherry. It was an afternoon dedicated to the preservation of the past, an occupation pursued with a quiet tenacity that suggested the present was a rather regrettable affair. Presiding over this solemn festivity was Mr. Alastair Finch, the Society's chairman. Mr. Finch was a thin, desiccated man whose posture seemed permanently braced against the threat of some impending grammatical error. To him, history was not a matter of narrative, but of cataloguing. It was a sequence of correctly dated events to be marshalled into order. Much like the meticulously ordered pamphlets on his desk, his opening address, delivered from the top step of the terrace, was a masterpiece of dry precision. He touched upon the Society's recent acquisition of a Victorian post-box, the lamentable state of the church lich-gates pointing, and the gratifyingly prompt payment of annual subscriptions. The 40 or so members dotted across the lawn in folding chairs listened with the polite, glazed stillness of those who knew their duty. Inspector Pubright of the Chalmsbury Borough Police, present in a civilian capacity as a guest of the town clerk, stood near a rhododendron bush nursing a cup of tea. He found such events deeply soothing. They were a confirmation that civilization, however precariously, was still holding its course. He watched Mr. Finch, whose peroration was now approaching its climax, the afternoon's principal attraction. "And so it is with considerable pride," Mr. Finch announced, his voice rising by a carefully modulated semitone, "that we once again afford the public an opportunity to view the jewel in the Vetchwood collection. I refer, of course, to the Vetchwood portrait, known to us all, with a certain local affection, as the Laughing Lady." A ripple of polite applause, thin as a water biscuit, travelled through the assembly. Everyone knew the Laughing Lady. The portrait of Lady Agnes Vetchwood, painted in the late 17th century by an artist whose obscurity was, on viewing the work, entirely understandable, was famous not for its beauty but for its comprehensive lack of it. Lady Agnes had been captured in a moment of supposed mirth. The result was less a laugh than a rictus of alarming dental enthusiasm. Her eyes, small and set a fraction too close together, held a look of manic glee, while her complexion had the mottled, ruddy quality of improperly cured ham. It was a face that could curdle milk. Standing slightly apart from the crowd, as befitted her lineage, was Miss Beatrice Plumley. She was, she often reminded people, the last of the Vetchwood line, a fact that seemed to afford her a great deal of historical importance, but very little contemporary income. Dressed in a faded lavender frock that might have been fashionable during the Regency, she inclined her head graciously, as if accepting the applause on her ancestors' behalf. "A masterpiece of the primitive school," she was heard to murmur to the vicar's wife. One feels the artist was not constrained by mere technical skill. He captured her very soul. The vicar's wife, a kind woman, nodded vaguely. "Quite so. Full of life." The arrangement was that members could, in small, orderly groups, leave the lawn, enter the hall's rather musty drawing-room, and spend a few moments in contemplation before the portrait, which had been placed on a heavy oak easel near the French windows. This system, devised by Mr. Finch to prevent what he called unseemly crowding, was adhered to with typical English deference. Pubright, having no immediate desire to gaze upon Lady Agnes's unnerving smile, remained by his bush. He observed the small pageant of municipal life. Councillor Mrs. Pym, a woman whose hats always seemed to be advancing a motion of no confidence, was in deep conversation with the borough surveyor. Gesturing pointedly, at a patch of rising damp on the hall's exterior wall. Sergeant Love, Pubright's subordinate, was making a methodical and determined assault on the sausage rolls, his expression one of professional concentration. The afternoon wore on. The sun made a brief, watery attempt to appear, failed, and gave up. The queue for the drawing-room dwindled. Mr. Finch, his official duties discharged, allowed himself a small, tight smile of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to the minutes of the last planning meeting. The first hint of irregularity came not with a shout, but with a frown. Mrs. Gable, the society's treasurer, emerged from the drawing-room looking puzzled. "Alistair," she said, approaching the chairman.
"Have you moved her already?"
Mr. Finch's smile vanished. "Moved whom, Marjorie? Please be specific. Lady Agnes, of course."
"She's not on the easel. I presumed you'd had her put away for safekeeping." "Certainly not," sniffed Mr. Finch. "The viewing period does not conclude for another 20 minutes.
"It is on the schedule." To depart from the schedule was, in Mr. Finch's world, a cardinal sin. He strode towards the hall with an air of managerial displeasure, as if to reprimand the painting for its dereliction of duty. Several others followed, their curiosity piqued. A low murmur began to ripple back from the terrace. Inspector Pubright set down his teacup. Sergeant Love, sensing a shift in the professional atmosphere, swallowed the last of a Victoria sponge and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. By the time Pubright reached the French windows, the scene inside the drawing-room was one of quiet,
mannerly chaos. Mr. Finch was standing stock still, his face pale with indignation.
The heavy oak easels stood empty, a stark wooden skeleton. Of Lady Agnes and her terrifying laugh there was no sign whatsoever. Miss Beatrice Plumley pushed her way to the front. She took one look at the vacant easel, placed a trembling hand to her throat, and let out a small, bird-like cry. "She's gone," she whispered, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "My ancestress. She has been abducted." The word abducted hung in the air of the drawing-room, a rather dramatic garment for such a drab little crime. Mr. Finch corrected it at once. "Stolen, Miss Plumley. The correct term is stolen." He spoke as though the portrait's disappearance was primarily a breach of semantics. Inspector Pubright, stepping quietly past the flustered chairman, exchanged a look with Sergeant Love. It was a look that communicated a great deal, passing from the need for notebooks to the deferment of any further sausage rolls, and concluding with a shared, unspoken resignation. The quiet afternoon was officially over, while Sergeant Love, with the methodical tread of a man who trusted procedure above all else, began the dreary task of taking names. News of the theft slipped out of Vetchwood Hall's gates and began its journey into the town. It travelled first with Mrs. Bledsoe, who had a telephone call to make concerning a bridge evening and saw no reason why a minor felony should delay it. From her it passed, slightly embellished, to the recipient of the call, and from there it leapt into the fertile soil of Chalmsbury's gossip network. By 6 o'clock, in the chintz-laden tea-room of the Spinning Wheel, it was understood that a priceless masterpiece, possibly a lost Gainsborough, had been slashed from its frame by a gang of ruthless professionals. By 7:30, in the saloon bar of the Chow Hotel, the story had matured. The painting was now a Titian, secretly owned by the royal family, and its theft was the work of an eccentric American millionaire who had landed a helicopter in the adjacent water meadows. The only consistent detail in every version of the tale was that Lady Agnes's portrait was, on its own merits, spectacularly ugly. This fact seemed to give the whole affair a piquant, almost comical, flavour that the citizens of Chalmsbury found deeply satisfying. Councillor Mrs. Eunice Pym heard the news from the borough surveyor, whom she had cornered over the state of the town's hanging baskets. Her reaction was not one of shock, but of grim vindication.
"Stolen?" she
She said, her voice resonant with prophetic certainty. From under their very noses, It simply demonstrates what I've been saying for years. Alistair Finch and his committee are entirely unfit to be custodians of a significant public asset. The hall is a security shambles. It requires firm, municipal management. The surveyor, a man who had learned that nodding was the safest form of discourse with Mrs. Pym, nodded. The theft of the laughing lady was, to the councillor, not a crime, but an opportunity. Back at the police station, Sergeant Love was compiling a list. His imagination, a tidy and well-regulated instrument, did not stray into the realms of international art thieves. He was a firm believer in the principle that most crimes are committed by the usual people for the usual reasons. "A prank, most likely," he said to Pubright, tapping his pencil against a list of names. "Young Perkins from the estate has a record for this sort of thing. High spirits, he calls it. Last time it was the mayor's ceremonial spade. We found it 3 weeks later at the top of the church flagpole." Pubright looked down at the list. "Does young Perkins have an interest in 17th century portraiture, Sidney?" "He has an interest in causing trouble," Love replied, with unshakable logic. "It's a big ugly painting, easy to see, easy to carry off while everyone's busy with the Battenberg. They'll probably dump it in the canal once the joke wears off." This was a neat, straightforward theory. It required no complex motive and pointed towards a familiar culprit. It was the sort of case Sergeant Love understood. Pubright made no comment, turning his gaze to the window that looked out onto Chalmsbury's orderly market square. He was thinking of the expressions he had witnessed in that drawing room. Mr. Finch's prim outrage, which seemed directed more at the violation of his timetable than his collection, and Miss Plumley's distress, which had felt just a little too perfectly pitched, like a piece of amateur dramatics. It was all very peculiar. A worthless object, an invisible thief, and a cast of characters for whom the disappearance seemed to serve as a confirmation of their own private obsessions. The theft was a stone dropped into the placid pond of Chalmsbury. Life, and Pubright was content for the moment to simply watch the ripples spread. The following morning, Inspector Pubright sat at his desk, contemplating a report on a stolen bicycle. Order, he reflected, was a fragile commodity. It took a great deal of effort to maintain and very little to disrupt. The theft of Lady Agnes. Vetchwood, while trivial in the grand scheme of criminality, had introduced a note of discord into the town's placid composition, and it was his job to resolve it. He had invited Mr. Alistair Finch to the station for a formal statement, an invitation Mr. Finch had accepted with the grim alacrity of a man who felt the entire affair was a personal affront. He arrived at 10 o'clock precisely, clutching a leather-bound file. "I have prepared a preliminary report for your consideration, Inspector," he began, placing the file on Purbright's desk, as if it were a sacred text. "It details the Society's security protocols for public exhibitions, protocols which, I must add, have been perfectly adequate for the past 47 years. "I'm sure they have, Mr. Finch," Pubright said soothingly. "Perhaps you could just tell me about yesterday. Did you notice anyone paying undue attention to the portrait?" Mr. Finch pursed his lips. Undue attention? The purpose of the event was to pay it attention. That is why it was exhibited. He seemed to find the question illogical. There was the usual shuffling. People looked, made their predictable little jokes about Lady Agnes's dental work and moved on. It is what they always do. And its value? For our records. This question animated Mr. Finch. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone. "Let me be clear, Inspector. Its monetary value is negligible, utterly negligible. We had it appraised for insurance purposes in 1982. The man from the auction house was, to be frank, rather rude about it. Its value is purely archival. It is the only known likeness of the wife of Sir Gideon Vetchwood, who founded the grammar school. Its theft is not a financial loss. It is an insult to local history. It is an act of profound, mindless vandalism. He spoke the last words with a low, controlled fury, the anger of a librarian who has found a book returned with a page folded down. "So you wouldn't consider it a masterpiece of the primitive school?" Pubright asked, his tone one of mild curiosity. Mr. Finch emitted a short, sharp sound that was almost a laugh. "Good heavens, no, that is a piece of romantic nonsense peddled by Miss Plumley. She has convinced herself that her family's utter lack of artistic patronage is a virtue. The painting is a daub, Inspector. An interesting, historically significant daub, but a daub nonetheless." He seemed pleased to have set the record straight, as if correcting a typo in the annals of history. An hour later, Pubright sat in the small, over-furnished sitting room of Miss Beatrice Plumley. The room smelled of lavender polish and gentle decay. Miss Plumley, holding a delicate porcelain cup, was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "It is the violation I find so hard to bear, Inspector," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "To have her taken from us. She has hung in Vetchwood Hall for 300 years. She was a constant, my constant." "You were very fond of her, then?" Pubright prompted gently. "Fond? Oh, much more than fond. I felt I knew her. I used to visit her, you know. I would sit in the drawing room and simply talk to her. People found her appearance challenging, but I saw through that. I saw her spirit. The artist captured her laughter, her very essence. It's what makes the painting such a treasure. It is a work of pure, untutored genius." She placed her cup down with a delicate clatter. "Mr. Finch, with his lists and his dates, he could never understand that. He sees a historical artifact, I see family." "And you believe it to be valuable?" "Priceless," she declared without hesitation. "How can one put a price on heritage, on a soul captured in oils? There are collectors, you know, people of taste and discernment, who appreciate the raw power of the naive style. It is not something you can quantify in a dreary insurance document." Her gaze drifted towards the window, as if she could see the laughing lady being auctioned for a king's ransom at Sotheby's. Pubright listened patiently. He had, in the space of 2 hours, been presented with 2 entirely irreconcilable portraits of the stolen painting. To one man it was a worthless but historically important document, to the other a priceless masterpiece of sentimental art. One of them, he considered, was describing an object, the other was describing an idea, and it was the gap between the object and the idea that he now found most interesting. He thanked Miss Plumley for her time, leaving her to her performance of genteel grief, and walked back towards the station under the same indecisive grey sky. Chalmsbury was a town that held a quiet suspicion of outsiders. It was not an unfriendly place, but it operated on a network of established connections, of shared histories that stretched back through generations of market days and church fetes. A new face was an event, a subject for mild and meticulous speculation. It was therefore unsurprising that when Sergeant Love made his patient inquiries among the attendees of the Historical Society's garden party, a new face was precisely what was remembered. The information came from Mrs. Gable, the Society's treasurer, a woman whose observations were as precise as her accounts. "There was a gentleman," she recalled, "whom I did not recognize, very well dressed, a tweed jacket of a rather fashionable cut. He wasn't a member." "And what was he doing?" Love asked, his pencil poised. "He was talking to Alastair Finch for some time, and then he spent a rather long while looking at the painting. Not just looking, Sergeant, examining. He was peering at the canvas as if he were trying to read the fine print." Further discreet questions revealed more. The man had spoken to several people, introducing himself as being in the trade. He had a smooth, pleasant manner that was just a shade too polished for the damp lawns of Vetchwood Hall. And, most significantly, Mr. Finch's insistence on a visitor's book, a source of some grumbling at the time, now paid a dividend. On the third page, between the shaky signature of a superannuated schoolmistress and the illegible scrawl of the town's mayor, was a neat, confident hand, Julian Croft, London. A telephone call to Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques unit produced a prompt and interesting result. Mr. Julian Croft was indeed in the trade. He was a dealer with a small but respectable gallery in St. James's, known for handling provincial pieces and, as the officer on the other end of the line put it, unearthing the occasional sleeper. He had no criminal record but was known for his sharp eye and even sharper business practices. Sergeant Love presented his findings to Inspector Pubright with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place. "It's not a prank, sir," he said, standing before Purbright's desk. "It's professional. This fellow Croft comes down from London. He's an expert. He spots something in the painting that no one else has. Maybe it's painted over another, more valuable picture. Or maybe he recognizes the artist's hand. He makes a few casual inquiries, probably to see if the locals have any idea of its real worth. Mrs. Gable remembers him asking her what it was insured for. He paused for effect. When he realizes it's considered worthless, he sees his chance, waits for a moment when the drawing room is empty between those little groups Mr. Finch organized, and simply walks out with it. He's probably halfway to selling it to a private collector by now. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. It accounted for the seemingly irrational theft of an ugly painting. It explained the presence of the stranger. It provided a clear, comprehensible motive: greed. It transformed the crime from a piece of local mischief into a proper case, a contest between provincial police work and metropolitan cunning. It fits Miss Plumley's assessment of its value, at any rate, Pubright noted mildly. "Exactly, sir," Love agreed, pleased that the inspector was following his logic. She was right all along, even if she didn't know why. It is a treasure. This Croft fellow was the only one clever enough to see it. For Sergeant Love, the case was now tidily resolved in principle, with only the tiresome business of locating Mr. Croft and recovering the evidence remaining. The untidy contradictions of Mr. Finch and Miss Plumley, the peculiar atmosphere of the garden party, all these were swept aside by the clean, strong current of a logical narrative. An expert had come, had seen, and had conquered. Pubright leaned back in his chair. He nodded slowly, giving nothing away. "A very plausible theory, Sidney. An excellent piece of work. Get in touch with the Metropolitan Police.
Ask them to pay a call on Mr. Croft at his gallery." "Right away, sir," said Love, turning to leave with a new spring in his step. The inspector watched him go.
The solution was perhaps a little too neat. It answered the question of who and how, but it left Pubright with a lingering sense of unease. He thought of a professional art thief, a man who presumably valued discretion and timing, choosing to operate in the middle of the afternoon, surrounded by 40 witnesses who would remember his fashionable tweed jacket, all to steal a painting he could not possibly have known would be there until he arrived. It seemed a remarkably clumsy way for a clever man to behave. While Sergeant Love was engaged in the brisk and satisfying business of liaising with the Metropolitan Police, Inspector Pubright devoted his morning to the less dramatic task of paperwork. On his desk lay a small pile of items relating to the Vetchwood case, Sergeant Love's neatly typed report outlining the incontrovertible guilt of Mr. Julian Croft, a list of the garden party attendees, and a glossy pamphlet produced for the occasion, titled Vetchwood Hall, A Brief History and Guide. It had been written, Pubright noted from the credits page, by Alastair Finch, a fact that guaranteed its contents would be meticulously, if aridly, accurate. He opened it out of a sense of thoroughness, his eye skimming over paragraphs detailing 13th century masonry and 18th century death watch beetle. He turned a page and found himself face to face with Lady Agnes. It was a black and white photograph, professionally taken, occupying a full half page. The reproduction was sharp, capturing the unfortunate portrait in all its glory. The crazed eyes, the stiff lace collar, and the famous laugh, a wide, unhinged slash across the lower half of the face. Pubright studied the smile. It was a formidable piece of dental architecture, a great wall of teeth presented to the world with unnerving confidence. He looked at it, then looked away, his mind drifting back to the cloying lavender scent of Miss Plumley's sitting room. He replayed her words, her tremulous, heartfelt lament for her departed ancestress. And then a specific phrase floated to the surface of his memory, clear and distinct. People found her appearance challenging. But I saw through that. Even her ghastly yet characterful, chipped front tooth. He looked back at the photograph. He held the pamphlet closer to the light from the window. He located the front teeth, a task made simple by their prominence, and examined them one by one. There was no chip, not the slightest hint of one. Lady Agnes's smile was a continuous, unbroken, and quite ghastly rampart of pristine enamel. Pubright sat back in his chair. It was, of course, a triviality.
A nothing.
There were a dozen explanations. The photograph could be an old one, taken before the damage occurred. The lighting could have obscured the detail. Or most likely of all, Miss Plumley, in her agitated state, had simply misspoken. Memory, he knew, was a notoriously unreliable narrator, especially when burnished with sentiment. And yet, it was the sort of detail one would expect a person who claimed an intimate, spiritual connection with the portrait to get right. It was not a question of the lace's pattern or the exact shade of the background. It was a prominent feature on the subject's face, the very flaw she had singled out as a mark of its character. To mistake it seemed careless. He picked up the telephone and dialed the number for the town library, where Mr. Finch served as chief librarian. "Finch," a crisp voice answered. "Pubright here." "Mr. Finch, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Inspector, I am in the middle of collating the quarterly acquisitions list, but for you, I can spare a moment." "Have you apprehended the London villain?" "We're making enquiries," Pubright said smoothly. "I'm calling about a small point of detail in your excellent guide to the Hall. For my report." "Oh?"
"I should be surprised if there were any inaccuracies."
"I proofread it myself, twice. I'm sure you did. It concerns the photograph of the laughing lady. I was simply wondering when it was taken." There was a brief pause. Pubright could almost hear the man's mind accessing the relevant file. "Let me see. The photographer was commissioned on April the 12th. The shoot took place on May the 3rd of this year. I was present myself to ensure the lighting was optimal and that the representation was entirely faithful to the original work." "Why do you ask?" "Just confirming the timeline," Pubright said. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Finch. You've been most precise." He replaced the receiver gently. So the photograph was recent, and its accuracy had been personally guaranteed by a man for whom accuracy was a religion. The discrepancy, then, was not on the page, but in the memory of Miss Beatrice Plumley. A woman who professed to love a painting had described it with a significant and verifiably false detail. It was a very small, very strange crack in the edifice of the case, and for the first time, Inspector Pubright felt he had something genuinely interesting to think about. The trouble with a neat theory, Pubright reflected, is that it discourages further thought. With Sergeant Love confidently awaiting news from London regarding Mr. Croft, the Vetchwood case was in danger of becoming settled fact. Pubright, however, was now more interested in the context than the crime itself. The painting's theft was beginning to seem less like the main event and more like a catalyst, something that had agitated the quiet waters of Chalmsbury and brought curious things to the surface. To this end,
he paid a visit to Dr. Armitage. The doctor was a large,
tweed-clad man whose bedside manner was a bracing mixture of medical authority and amateur historical certainty. He was also the long-standing and very public rival of Alastair Finch in all matters concerning local law. Pubright found him in his surgery's overgrown garden aggressively pruning a rose bush. "Heard you've got a suspect," Armitage grunted, snipping off a branch with savage satisfaction. "Some sharp-suited spiv from London."
"Hope you catch him."
"Still can't imagine what he wants with that dreadful thing." "There seems to be some disagreement about its artistic merit," Pubright offered. The doctor let out a snort. "Artistic merit?"
"It has none."
Alistair Finch can bleat on all he likes about its archival importance, and that dotty Miss Plumley can call it a masterpiece, but they're both wrong. "The thing's a fraud." He paused, leaning on his shears and warming to his favourite topic. The original Vetchwood portrait, which by all accounts was just as ugly, was destroyed in the West Wing fire of 1886. It's all in the parish records. The family, embarrassed by the loss and too stingy to commission a proper artist, had a copy made by a local sign painter.
"A sign painter, Inspector?"
The brushwork is appalling, the canvas is late Victorian, and the pigments are all wrong for the period.
"I've told Finch this for years, but the man won't listen."
It contradicts the Society's official catalogue, you see. And for Alistair, if it isn't in the catalogue, it isn't history. This information, delivered with the absolute conviction of the hobbyist, added another layer of complication. The painting was not merely worthless. It was, in one expert's opinion, a fake, a copy of a lost original.
Why would a professional art thief steal a fraudulent painting?
And why would Miss Plumley lavish such sentimental devotion on a counterfeit? Later that afternoon, Pubright attended a meeting of the Chalmsbury Borough Council's Subcommittee for Parks and Municipal Properties. He sat at the back of the public gallery, an unobtrusive presence. The main item on the agenda, as he had expected, was the future use of Vetchwood Hall, the theft had provided Councillor Mrs. Pym with the perfect platform. "This regrettable incident," she began, her tone managing to convey both sorrow and triumph, "highlights a critical failure of oversight. An asset belonging to the people of this town has been compromised. It is clear that the current arrangement with the Historical Society is no longer tenable." Alistair Finch, present in his capacity as Society chairman, sat bolt upright. "I object to that characterization," he interjected, his voice tight. "The Society has managed the hall impeccably for nearly half a century." "Impeccably?" Mrs. Pym's eyebrows rose. "A valuable portrait has vanished from under your nose, Alistair."
"I do not call that impeccable. I call it negligent." She turned to the rest of the committee.
"The hall is underused and, as we now see, insecure. My proposal for a multi-purpose community wellness hub with yoga classes, mindfulness workshops, and a state-of-the-art play area would revitalize the building and serve the entire community, not just a handful of dusty academics. The ensuing debate was a grimly fascinating spectacle. It was a battle between two worlds, Finch's, which was concerned with provenance, preservation, and the correct labelling of artifacts, and Mrs. Pym's, which was filled with mission statements, stakeholder engagement, and capital investment. The stolen painting was rarely mentioned, but its ghost haunted the proceedings. For Mrs. Pym, its absence was a blessing, a convenient justification for her long-held ambitions. For Mr. Finch, it was a humiliation, a weapon being used against him by the forces of relentless modernity. Pubright listened to it all, the polite, vicious undertones of small-town politics. He had come to understand that the laughing lady, in her 300-year history, had likely never been so important. Dead, she was a joke. Stolen, she had become a motive, not just for a thief perhaps, but for anyone who stood to gain from the quiet chaos she had left behind. Mr. Horace Higgins, the custodian of Chalmsbury's municipal parks, was a man engaged in a slow, undeclared war against the forces of entropy. His enemies were legion, dandelions, dogs that ignored signs, and above all, the inexplicable human urge to discard things in inappropriate places. His primary theatre of operations was the ornamental pond in the centre of Priory Gardens, a body of water whose placid surface concealed a gloomy collection of sunken bottles, abandoned toys, and the occasional traffic cone. On the Thursday morning following the theft, while conducting his weekly patrol with a long-handled rake, Mr. Higgins snagged something unusually resistant. It was heavy, flat, and wrapped in what appeared to be common garden twine. With a sigh of profound weariness, he braced himself and heaved. The object broke the surface with a muddy, sucking sound and flopped onto the grass. It was a rectangular canvas, weighted at the bottom by a house brick. Mr. Higgins scraped away a layer of green slime with the edge of his boot. What was revealed beneath was a painting, or, to be more precise, a smear of garish wet colours that bore a passing and deeply unflattering resemblance to a human face. Even through the grime and water damage, the face was horribly familiar. It was the Laughing Lady, rendered in a style that suggested the artist had been working in the dark during an earth tremor, and with a decorator's brush. Having dutifully reported his discovery, Mr. Higgins stood by with his arms folded as Sergeant Love arrived on the scene. Love looked at the dripping canvas, then at the placid pond, then back at the canvas. His expression was one of deep, professional consternation. This object did not belong in his carefully constructed narrative. International art thieves did not paint crude replicas and dump them in ponds with a brick tied to them. This was the work of a local lout, the sort of thing his original suspect, young Perkins, might have done. But young Perkins was not a suspect anymore. Mr. Julian Croft was the suspect, and Mr. Croft, Sergeant Love felt certain, would not have access to the park keeper's supply of garden twine. Inspector Pubright arrived a few minutes later. He nodded a greeting to Mr. Higgins and stood beside Sergeant Love, contemplating the find. "It's a copy, sir," Love stated, as if hoping the inspector might have mistaken it for the genuine article.
"A very bad one." "So I see, Sidney," Pubright said.
The paint was thick and amateurish, still tacky in places despite its immersion. The colours were brighter, cruder. The manic glee in the eyes had been replaced by a sort of vacant bewilderment. It was less a portrait and more a caricature. Pubright crouched down for a closer look. "It makes no sense," Love continued, thinking aloud. "Why steal the original and then go to the trouble of painting this mess, and then just throw it in the pond? It looks like a prank after all." He sounded disappointed, his elegant theory of metropolitan cunning crumbling into muddy provincial farce. Pubright did not seem to be listening. His attention was fixed, quite intently on the portrait's mouth. He pointed a finger towards the garish, grinning teeth. "What do you make of that, Sidney?" Sergeant Love bent down. The replica's smile was, if anything, even more crowded and alarming than the original's. But there was one significant addition. On one of the upper front teeth the artist had placed a small, but very distinct black chip. It was painted with a deliberate, almost emphatic touch, a clear focal point in the messy composition. Love stared at it, utterly mystified.
"A chip? I don't recall a chip on the real one." "Nor do I," said Pubright, his voice very quiet.
"Nor does Mr. Finch's official photograph." He stood up, his gaze moving from the dripping replica on the grass to the distant slate roofs of the town. The case had just become infinitely more complicated and, for him, infinitely more interesting. The crude object at their feet was not just a bad painting, it was a message. It was a physical manifestation of a flawed memory, a bizarre piece of evidence that connected not to the crime itself, but to one person's very particular and very peculiar recollection of it. The tidy, logical framework of the investigation had dissolved, and something much stranger was beginning to take its place. Back in the quiet sanctuary of his office, Inspector Pubright had the unfortunate replica propped against a filing cabinet. Divorced from the pond slime, it looked even worse. It was a portrait not of a person, but of an insult. Sergeant Love, his theory of an elegant London art thief now in tatters, had retreated into a baffled silence, dutifully filling out property recovery forms. Pubright, meanwhile, made himself a cup of tea and sat down to think. The case had begun as a simple, if peculiar, theft. Now it had acquired a second act, a baffling epilogue involving a crude copy and a fictitious dental flaw. All the straightforward motives seemed to peel away under the slightest scrutiny. Greed unlikely. If the painting was secretly valuable, the thief would not be painting copies and sinking them in the local pond. If it were worthless, there was no profit in stealing it. The London dealer, Mr. Croft, began to look less like a suspect and more like a convenient red herring. Nor did it feel like a prank. A prank requires an audience.
A stolen gnome on a rooftop, a statue adorned with a traffic cone. These are public jests.
This was a private, almost secretive act. The theft was quiet, the replica disposed of with clumsy stealth. The humour, if any was intended, was exceptionally obscure. Pubright took a sip of tea. He looked from the crude daub in the corner to the window overlooking the orderly town. When logic fails, he knew one must look to human nature. And the theft of the laughing lady, he was beginning to suspect, was not a crime of logic, but of emotion. It was a crime rooted in that most potent and irrational of forces, family pride. He thought of Miss Beatrice Plumley, a woman living in reduced circumstances whose only remaining currency was her ancestry. Her lineage was her identity. She spoke of her ancestress not as a painting, but as a presence, a constant in her life. In a town like Chalmsbury, such things still mattered.
A good name, a long history, these were intangible assets to be polished and preserved.
Much like the family silver she had likely long since sold. But what if the central symbol of that heritage was a source not of pride, but of profound, unceasing embarrassment? For generations, Lady Agnes had been a local joke. The laughing lady was a nickname born of mockery, not affection. For a descendant who must publicly defend the portrait as a masterpiece, every snigger, every predictable witticism must have felt like a small personal wound. Pubright considered the quiet tyranny of inheritance. People felt obliged to revere the things that were passed down to them, to treat ugly furniture as precious heirlooms and unpleasant ancestors as noble forebears. They curate their own histories, smoothing over the awkward parts, quietly editing out the failures. Most people did this with tactful omissions and flattering anecdotes. But what if the embarrassing artifact was a 6-foot canvas on permanent public display? The crime, he suspected, was an act of historical censorship. Someone had wanted not to possess the painting, but simply for it to cease to exist in the public eye. It was an attempt to erase an unflattering smudge from the family record. And the replica, that was the most telling part of all. It was an act of pure spite. To paint a copy was strange enough, but to paint it with a flaw that the original did not possess, a chipped tooth described as ghastly, that was personal. It was the gesture of someone who had stared at that smiling face for a lifetime, not with affection, but with a deep and festering resentment. It was a private joke, a final secret insult to the woman whose ghastly laugh had haunted a family for 300 years. The case, Pubright concluded as he finished his tea, was not about a theft at all. It was about a vanity, or more precisely, the bitter curdling of it. A theory, however elegant, remains a ghost until it is met with substance. Having spent a day contemplating the emotional architecture of the crime, Inspector Pubright decided it was time to test the foundations. To this end, he arranged what he termed an informal viewing in a spare interview room at the station. The room was small, painted a dispiriting shade of beige, and furnished with a table and several mismatched chairs. The only other object present was the replica of the laughing lady, now dry and propped on a police evidence easel, looking more malevolent than ever under the single, buzzing fluorescent light. He had invited the 3 people in Chalmsbury with the most proprietary interest in the painting. Mr. Alistair Finch was the first to arrive, and he viewed the replica with the expression of a botanist encountering a plastic flower. "A travesty," he pronounced, his voice thin with contempt. It is not merely a poor likeness, it is an act of active vandalism. The artist, if one can use such a term, should be prosecuted for crimes against aesthetics. Dr. Armitage arrived moments later, his reaction one of undisguised glee. "Magnificent," he boomed, striding into the room. "It's the perfect tribute, don't you think?"
A fraudulent copy of a fraudulent original. There's a wonderful symmetry to it.
"You ought to hang this one in the hall, Alistair. It's far more honest." Mr. Finch's back stiffened. "I fail to see the humour, Doctor."
A piece of the town's heritage has been stolen. A piece of Victorian sign painting has been misplaced, Armitage retorted.
Let's maintain a sense of proportion. It was into this atmosphere of simmering historical debate that Miss Beatrice Plumley was shown. She was dressed in sombre grey, as if attending a funeral. She stopped just inside the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of well-rehearsed shock.
"Oh, my heavens," she breathed. What is that monstrosity?"
"That, Miss Plumley," said Pubright, stepping forward, "is what we recovered from the pond in Priory Gardens. We were hoping you might, confirm that it is not, in fact, the genuine article." "Genuine?" she said with a shaky laugh. "Inspector, it is a desecration. It is a child's scrawl."
"Look what they have done to her."
Her smile. She peered at the chipped tooth, a detail which, in this crude rendering, looked like a gaping wound. "It is vile." Pubright let the three of them talk, their voices overlapping in a discordant symphony of opinion. Finch fussed over the damage to the town's reputation. Armitage repeated his theories about the original's lack of authenticity with growing relish, and Miss Plumley gave a compelling performance of a woman wounded to the very soul of her lineage. Sergeant Love sat in a corner, notebook open, his expression one of complete bewilderment. After allowing the temperature in the room to rise for several minutes, Pubright held up a hand. "Thank you all. Your opinions are most helpful." His voice was calm, cutting through the bickering. He walked over to the replica and tapped the canvas lightly. "It's a poor thing, certainly, but it raises questions. Who would paint it?
"And why?"
He paused, looking thoughtfully at the painting. "It's remarkable what modern science can contribute to even the most minor of cases. Forensics, you know." He addressed the room at large, his tone conversational. "They can take the smallest sample of paint, even from a cheap amateur set like this was probably made with, and analyze its chemical composition. Every batch has a unique signature. They can often trace it right back to the shop where it was sold and sometimes even the date of purchase. Terribly clever." He let the statement hang in the beige air. Dr. Armitage grunted with interest. Mr. Finch looked impatient. Miss Plumley, Pubright noted, had become very still, her hands clasped tightly around the handle of her handbag. The inspector turned from the painting, his gaze moving past the two men and settling, with a look of polite inquiry, on her. The room was suddenly quiet. "It is a clumsy effort," he said, his voice gentle. "But there is a certain
energy to it, wouldn't you agree? A strange passion."
"Tell me, Miss Plumley, with your family's clear artistic connections, did you ever take up the brush yourself? Perhaps as a hobby? To try and capture a family likeness, for instance?" The question was simple, courteous, and utterly out of place. For a fraction of a second, the careful mask of the grieving descendant slipped. Her knuckles gripping her handbag turned white. Her breathing, which had been so theatrically shaky, momentarily stopped. The reply, when it came, was a fraction of a beat too late, and the pitch was a note too high. "Me, Inspector?" she said with a brittle little laugh.
"Oh, good heavens, no."
"I'm afraid I was not blessed with any of the family talent. Not the slightest scrap."
"I can barely draw a straight line." She looked away as she spoke, towards the grim little window.
It was enough. The denial was absolute, but the hesitation that preceded it had been a confession. Pubright gave a small, almost imperceptible nod.
"I see," he said.
"Well, thank you all for your time. You have been a great help." The meeting took place the following morning in the town clerk's office, a room panelled in dark, serious oak that had absorbed a century of discreet municipal anxieties. The air was heavy with the scent of floor polish, and the silent weight of official procedure. Chief Constable Chublock, a man who liked his crimes to have clear, prosecutable motives, sat at the head of the table, looking uncomfortable. To his left sat Mr. Alistair Finch, a picture of righteous indignation. To his right, a pale and silent Miss Beatrice Plumley. Inspector Pubright stood by the window, through which the unadventurous grey sky of Chalmsbury could be seen. "Right," the Chief Constable began, clearing his throat. "This business of the Vetchwood painting? A most irregular affair. Inspector Pubright seems to believe he has
Reached a conclusion, Inspector."
He gestured towards Pubright, a clear transfer of responsibility for the strangeness that was to come. Pubright turned from the window. He began not with an accusation, but with a summary of their failures. "Our investigation initially proceeded along conventional lines," he said, his voice calm and even. "We assumed a motive of theft for profit. This led us to the London art dealer, Mr. Croft, who seemed a most promising suspect." He paused. "However, enquiries have confirmed that Mr. Croft was attending a public auction in Bath on the day of the theft. He has never been to Vetchwood Hall in his life. He was a ghost, a convenient outsider onto whom we could project a logical motive." Mr. Finch shifted in his chair, looking displeased at this dismantling of a perfectly good theory. "The truth," Pubright continued, "is that this crime was never logical. It was not about profit because the painting has no significant monetary value. It was not, as Dr. Armitage would have it, a dispute over authenticity. It was about something far less tangible. It was about emotion." He began to walk slowly around the table, his footsteps soft on the old floorboards. "We think of history as a collection of facts and artifacts, but it is also a burden. A family's past can be a source of immense pride or of immense embarrassment. Consider a portrait famous in its own small world, not for its beauty or its subject's nobility, but for its ugliness. Consider that it is known by a nickname that is, in essence, a joke. For the last remaining descendant of that family, every polite smile, every half-hidden snigger might feel like a personal slight." He did not look at Miss Plumley, but the air around her seemed to grow heavy and still. "The case began to unravel with a small, trivial detail," Pubright went on. "A detail of dentistry. Miss Plumley, in her statement to me, described her ancestress as having a characterful chipped front tooth. It was a vivid, memorable detail, but it was incorrect. The original painting, as confirmed by a recent photograph, shows no such flaw." Mr. Finch's head came up, his expression one of sharp, academic interest. This was a matter of fact, a territory he understood. "A simple mistake, perhaps," Pubright said. "A trick of memory. But then a second object appears, a crude replica fished from a pond. An object which, in all its amateurish detail, contains one very deliberate feature: the chipped tooth.
A flaw that existed only in Miss Plumley's mind has been made real."
This tells us that the person who painted the replica is the same person who held that flawed memory. And it tells us something more. It is an act of aggression, a mark of spite painted onto the face that was the source of so much resentment. He stopped behind Miss Plumley's chair. Her head was bowed. The sequence of events then becomes clear. It was not a theft plan by a master criminal, but an act of desperation. Miss Plumley, dreading the renewed focus on the painting that the garden party and the new catalogue would bring, decided to remove it. The first plan, perhaps, was to create a substitute. She painted the replica, intending to swap them over. But her courage failed her. A direct swap was too complex, too risky. So on the day of the party, amidst the tea and conversation, she took a simpler, more desperate path. She found a moment when the drawing room was empty, took the painting from its easel, concealed it, in a large shopping bag perhaps, or under a loose coat, and simply walked away. No one would suspect the grieving descendant.
Later, panicked by what she had done, and with no use for the evidence of her original plan, she threw the replica into the municipal pond. He fell silent.
The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. The chief constable stared, his mouth slightly agape, trying to process a motive that could not be written on a charge sheet. Mr. Finch looked as if he
had been personally betrayed by the irrationality
of the entire human race. Pubright moved to stand before Miss Plumley. His voice, when he spoke, was very gentle. It was never about greed, was it? It was about peace and quiet, about ending the humiliation of having to pretend to revere something you had come to loathe, about silencing the laughing lady once and for all. Is that not the truth of it, Miss Plumley? For a long moment she said nothing. Then a single tear rolled down her cheek and splashed onto the polished oak of the table. She gave a small, shuddering nod. "She laughed at me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "All my life she has been laughing at me." There was, of course, no question of prosecution. To put Miss Plumley in the dock for the theft of her own family's unwanted heirloom struck even Chief Constable Tublock as a step beyond the absurd. It was a matter, he concluded with some relief, for discretion rather than justice. The original painting was recovered later that day from a large, moth-scented ottoman in Miss Plumley's spare bedroom, its ghastly smile mercifully muffled by a collection of winter blankets. The file was officially closed. The Chalmsbury Borough Police Force could return to more pressing matters, such as parking infringements on market day. A quiet arrangement was made for the portrait's future. At Inspector Pirbright's suggestion, Miss Plumley agreed to place her ancestress on a long-term and likely permanent loan. A small, poorly funded museum in the Orkney Islands, which specialized in maritime history but was grateful for any donation, accepted the offer with bewildered enthusiasm. Lady Agnes Vetchwood, having spent 3 centuries laughing at the people of Chalmsbury, was crated up and dispatched on a northbound train to begin a new life overlooking a collection of fishing nets and rusty anchors. In the town, the ripples from the affair gently subsided. Councillor Mrs. Pym, deprived of the clear-cut case of negligence she had hoped for, found her arguments for turning Vetchwood Hall into a wellness hub lost their momentum. The incident had been too strange, too personal, to serve as effective political leverage. At the next council meeting, her motion was quietly shelved. Mr. Alastair Finch, deeply disturbed by the intrusion of raw, illogical emotion into his well-catalogued world, threw himself into preventative paperwork. He began drafting a complex 7-page amendment to the Historical Society's constitution, requiring a full psychological assessment for any member wishing to view an artifact to which they were related by blood or marriage. Dr. Armitage, for his part, was delighted by the outcome, and for weeks he regaled anyone who would listen in the bar of the Chauve Hotel with his definitive account of the embarrassing ancestress and the vengeful copy. A week after the confession, Inspector Pirbright sat at his desk. The Vetchwood file, now satisfyingly thick, lay in his out tray, destined for the archives. The unfortunate replica had been discreetly incinerated. The small dramas of the town had moved on, their brief intersection with the criminal law concluded. Pubright, as ever, remained at the centre, the calm fulcrum around which these passions turned, and eventually settled back into place. He took a sip of his tea and pulled a new file towards him. It was a complaint from a resident of Laburnham Close concerning the deliberate and malicious deadheading of 3 prize-winning hybrid tea roses by a person or persons unknown. He opened the file. The rhythms of Chalmsbury, he reflected, were eternal. There was always another form to fill in,